Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the tutorial today we're going to work on an endless knot Celtic style cross. That's what we're going to make today. I'll show you that on the board, we'll take a closer look and then we'll make a variation of this together. This is the Endless Knot Celtic cross project that we're going to work on together today. I'll show you how you can add a little bead to the centre later on if you want to, but for the base project we're going to be using 1mm or 18 gauge wire to create the main part, and then you can use 0.4 26 gauge or 0.5 24 gauge to create a woven bail. You can also use that wire to add in the bead should you wish to. Now for this project I'm going to be using my Beadalon memory wire finishing pliers. Now I basically treat these like a pair of round nose pliers or a small set of bail making pliers. They have become one of my most favourite tools, and no, I'm not on a kickback, I don't get paid to say that. So grab yourself some round nose pliers, multi-step bail makers, and if you haven't got any of these yet, grab yourself a pair now. Today I'm working with my favourite wire, which is raw copper, so this is not coated and it has a medium to medium soft flexibility to it. The first thing that we will do with this 12-inch length of 1mm or 18 gauge wire is just condition it. So let's grab one end and run thumb and forefinger over that wire about 4 or 5 times. Get that nice and warm and fluid and ready to go. As I mentioned, I'm going to be using my memory wire finishing pliers, which are a bit of a misnomer because they're so useful for literally everything else. I'm going to find the centre point. You could do that with a ruler if you wanted to. I'm going to eyeball it. I'm going to use the pliers to create a small curve down at the base. I'm using the 4mm side of my memory wire finishing pliers. I'm just going to cross that over. The distance between the curve down at the bottom and the crossover point will be the size of the base of this Celtic design. I'm going to switch to the smaller pin on my memory wire finishing pliers. This is a 4mm and a 2mm size on these very handy little pliers. And what I'm going to do is to continue in the direction that the wire just over here to the right of the screen. I'm going to pop those pliers in at the crossover point and just rotate that wire all the way around. Now before I go any further, I want to have a look at making this as flat as possible. So the wire that starts down at the bottom comes over to the left and crosses over towards the right of the screen, sits on top of the other wire. So what I'm going to do is every time my wire makes a cross over any other piece of wire, I'm going to ensure that it goes opposite to its previous crossing over. Now that sounds complicated, but it isn't. At present, the wire crosses over the top here. So I'm going to ensure that when I bring the tail of wire round, it goes underneath. It's very, very simple. And I'm going to bring that all the way around. Like so that sits over to the right hand side for now. I will be drawing that back slightly in a moment, but I just want you to see where it goes. So the wire started down at the base, the left hand wire goes over the top, turns around and it goes underneath itself. So we're creating a little bit of a spiral. Now it doesn't need to go all the way over there. I'm just going to pop those pliers back in and bring that back a little way. That's just to show you how this design works. Now I'm going to pop the pliers on the other side now, so we need to be looking at using the smaller of those two pins, so that's the 2mm pin, and I'm going to rotate the pliers around the wire until that little rounded section of wire that we're presently working on sits opposite to the other one. Now what we need to be aware of is where the wire last crossed. So the one that is on my pliers right now has gone underneath. So that means when I bring it around, I want it to go over the top. But because I want these two little loops to be opposite to one another, I've got to make sure that they sit evenly spaced. So let's bring this back into the proper orientation. Now it does look a little bit like this one is slightly higher up. So it's very easy to just pop those pliers back into position and continue rotating around. You do need to support that wire to make sure, and then bring those pliers back out again, and you can see that they now sit equal and opposite to each other. So what can sometimes happen if you're moving around those loops is that the size on the loop can change. So we do want to make sure that they stay tight to the pin on the pliers that we're using. And again, it doesn't need to go all the way over. I'm just kind of exaggerating that manoeuvre so that you can see where things are going. So just keep thinking about where the wire last crossed. So over here on the right hand side, we've got a loop and it went over the top, then it went underneath. So the next time this wire that I'm currently working on to the right hand side does a thing, it went underneath last time, means it's got to go over the top this time. Now this is not a tricky manoeuvre at all, but it can be marginally fiddly. So what we're going to do is to put the pin, the small pin, back into the position, and we're going to bring that wire all the way over, and we're just going to assess where we want to sit that pin. I have a very quick request for you. Now, as you know, the vast majority of the tutorials that I put out here on YouTube are indeed free of charge. So it takes between a day and 2 days every single week to create content like this. So every single time that you subscribe to the channel, drop a like on a video, leave me a comment, it really helps me to be seen by the wider YouTube community. And the more views, the better the channel will prosper. So if you would be so kind as to drop a like, maybe share on your socials, even consider dropping me a hype within the first week from the video upload. It really will go a long way towards helping me out. Thanks so much. So just take your time to make sure that you've got those two small loops equal and opposite to each other, remembering that these wires don't need to come hard over to the side. I exaggerated that movement to show you how to wrap that small loop. Let's head back down to the board and we'll add the next loop in. Lots and lots of little loops, as is quite often the case in Celtic Endless Knot designs. Now the key with this design is to make sure that you're always aware of where your last crossing over point occurred. So just here the wire has crossed underneath itself, so we're going to pop those pliers in again and just make sure that you get them in the correct orientation. So I'm going to put the small pin in the small loop and the large pin just over and slightly above to the right hand side. Now because the last crossing over was underneath, the next crossing over needs to be over the top. So if I draw that all the way around until we get back towards that pin, what you can do then is, because you've set where that's going to take place, is you can remove the smaller pin, pop the larger pin back in and draw that all the way around. Now at this stage you may find that you just need to open that out slightly so that when you bring the wire back down, it will sit down next to the first loop that you made and not on top of. So I always have my bent chain nose flat facing pliers on hand so that I can just adjust that and get it to sit down into position. So whenever we're crossing over underneath, then on top, then underneath, then on top. Now you can see that the next manoeuvre is going to be utilising the small pin. So I'm going to just bring the wire all the way across like so, pop the pin into position, and then we're going to bring the wire around. So because my last crossover point here is on top, you can see it's shining on top of the underneath wire. What we're going to do is ensure when we bring this wire around, it will go underneath. So if I show you that sideways, it's heading underneath the design. So again, you've got the basic size and position of the loop. You can bring the plier out, pop them back in again, and continue wrapping around. And again, that needs to go underneath. And you might need to just open the design out slightly to ensure that you can get this pass of wire next to the preceding loop. So if I put those pliers back in again, you might need to rotate them along a little bit and then bring the wire back again. So I'll pop in once more with those flat facing pliers, not crushing, but just making sure that the small loops sit above each other and that any curvy bits that line up side by side do so side by side and not higgledy-piggledy on top of one another. So what you would need to do then is I will flip over to this side because that's my dominant side and repeat the design again. So because I want to share this with you step by step, I'm going to show you now on the opposite side. So again, we're going to make sure that those two small loops are side by side, fully adjacent to each other. We're going to put the pliers into position. Let's have a look. Does that look like it's about right? Yes, it does. So we're going to draw the wire all the way around, taking note of where the last crossover point was, let's remove those pliers for a second, like so. So the last crossover point is on this location just underneath. So if I put my pliers back in, I'm going to need to draw that wire around over the top, and again just open that out slightly so that the two edges of the loops sit side by side, making sure that the two large loops are now also side by side and opposite one another. So that now gives us the opportunity to create the last loop on this side. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm happy with the shape and formation of the large, presently right hand side loop before I pop back in, put the big pin in, small pin in, take note of where the last crossover point was, which is on top. So going to bring the wire around, and it's going to need to go underneath. So if you bring your pins out of your work, I tend to work with quite a lot of tension, which is why it grabs on. I'm going to pop those pliers back in. Again, the last crossover point is on top, so this loop will need to go underneath. And in that way, you're not building a great big higgledy-piggledy pile of wire. It's only ever 2 wires deep. So let's bring that all the way around. Open it out if you need to make sure that the curvy bits that touch each other sit side by side. Bring the wire across at the top, remove, and then you can manually adjust any little sections that you need to get in there to do. So take a second, make sure that all of your loops are sitting equal and opposite to each other. You can make any small adjustments you need to after the fact. So let's just get that pin back in, and then we might need to just open that one out slightly so that it sits ever so slightly higher up. And once you're happy with that, we can move on to the next part. So it can take a moment just to get those loops to sit more evenly. So each of the large loops needs to be on the same plane in this orientation. Each of the small loops need to be both on the same plane in this orientation and the same plane in this orientation. So you have the opportunity just to take your time, slow down, and be sure that you're happy before we move on to the next stage of today's tutorial. 2 key takeaways at this point. Whenever the wire crosses over the top, the next move it needs to do is underneath. Secondly to that, you do need to try and keep everything equal and opposite. Now it does look a little bit like my small loop where we started off on the right hand side is a little bit low. So you can retrospectively just very gently make a few alterations if you need to. And once you've done that, we're going to very softly squish these down into position. Now to create a simplistic bail, you could very simply create the loop up at the top, utilising the 4mm side of those pliers, and go for a simple wrapped loop. The alternative that I'm going to show you now is to create with a woven bail. So let's pop those pliers back in up at the top, and I'm going to put the small pin just above the upper of the right hand most of those small loops and just cross that over. If I flip to the other side, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So sit that small pin on top of the small loop and just cross them over. And in that way you get an equivalent size large loop up at the top. I'm just going to make sure that that sits flat back, and you can obviously just check that if you need to. So if I pop that plier back in, I'm just going to draw that over slightly to make sure that I'm happy with where everything is sitting. So once you've got your loop up at the top sitting nicely, we're going to put 2 upright bends just to the side of that very central section. So if I do one on the right, then flip it over, and again on the other side. Now the key here is to really make sure that the 2 pieces of wire that form each of those semicircles is approximately the same size as the other. So you may need to make minor adjustments just to ensure that you get a good shape that you're happy with. In an ideal world, you will want those 2 wires to come up at an upright angle. So I'm quite happy with the overall form at this stage of the Endless Knot Celtic Inspired Cross. So what we're going to do is to now weave a section up at the top to create a simple bail that is nice and balanced. So you can either go for a teeny tiny little bail like this one, which is for a very, very fine chain. Or you could go for something a little larger, which you can use on any threading material that you fancy. Now I've got some antique bronze 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, and I'm going to work directly from the reel for this. Going to take a moment to make sure that these are smooth and warm and as straight as I need them to be for now. And I'm just going to do a basic 3 and 3 weave. Once I've got that added on to one of the posts, I'm going to trim away any excess. You can be thrifty if you wish to be, if you're working with a precious metal or anything like that. Just grab the correct pliers and make sure that that cut end is smoothed down. So let's bring that into the centre. If you need any further instructions on a 3 and 3 or figure of 8 weave, then I've got some dedicated videos for that. But very basically, we're wrapping 3 times on one side. The wire's coming up the middle. I'm going to wrap 3 times on the second side, and then back up the centre. So it's a case of repeating that for as long as you feel necessary. For a very large bail like this, it's around about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. For a teeny tiny bail like this, it really isn't very much at all. You'd only need to go for about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to continue weaving and I'll meet you back in a moment. I've created around about 1.25 inches, just over 1 inch really, of that 3 and 3 or figure of 8 basket weave. And what I'm going to do is to draw the wire forwards just above the top of that loop section at the top of the design. So if I show you that from the side, you'll see that it's coming away at around about a 45-degree angle. The next thing I'm going to do is to trim to around about 3/4 inch. Just past the woven section. We'll make the next step just a little bit easier. So let's pop that in the scrap pot for later. And what we're going to do is to start creating a rounded form backwards from that point. Now this piece of wood is just a little large for what I need, but it's going to get me close enough to create the next stage of the demo. So what we're going to do now is to bring these 2 pieces of wire through the uppermost loop of the design, and it's easier to do that before you create that circular bail form. So we'll put an angle just on them just here and post them or push them through up at the top of that design. So once they're through, you can bring your chosen round form back in to ensure the integrity of your bail shape. Again, this is just a little bit larger than I need, so it's going to be more of an oval bail than a round bail. They need to come all the way through that loop like so that you create a sealed situation. Maybe what we will do is just push that wire up slightly and get that to sit through at the very, very top of the design. Once you've got the 2 wires coming through, we don't want them to cross over. You can see here that they're crossing over. So I'm just going to uncross those and push them both out to the side. So they've gone through that loop up at the top. When they have gone through nice and neat, if you do have a round form that's the right size, perfect. If you don't, then we'll just work with it. It'll be absolutely fine. What I'm going to do now is to push them up and sideways, like so that it looks really nice and tidy. And then I'm going to draw them all the way over one more time so that you get one complete wrap. Now you may need to take a moment just to ensure that your bail hasn't gone AWOL. This one's gone a little bit out of shape. Once you're happy, we're going to trim those away just about 3mm or so longer than the point at which they pass over the top of that upper loop on your design. So all we're doing here is a very, very simple wrapped bail. Make sure that you keep the integrity of that upper large loop shape, and then just push those tails back through that central loop and give them a pinch. Very, very simplistic bail today. And just make sure that you capture the end there. You might need to just pull that through slightly to get it to where you want it to, and squish it flat so that it sits neatly on that upper loop section. So you can pick whichever side is your preferred. I like to see these cut ends smoothed down. So I'm just going to rotate my pliers around. That just smooths the end down so that it doesn't catch on anything. And then from this angle, Looks nice and neat and tidy. Again, if you have a round form that's exactly the right size, all the better. What I will likely do is reshape this after I have finished recording today, just to get a slightly better form for the photo for you. So if that's where you want to call it a stop, that's absolutely fine. That's your Endless Knot Celtic Inspired cross design, utilising these fantastic memory wire finishing pliers. I found that step number 5 on my multi-step bail makers was indeed the right size, and I've just used that to make sure that I'm happy with the roundness of my bail. I just wanted to share that with you so I wasn't kind of gatekeeping anything from you. That's just a really neat way to finish off, making it a little bit rounder at the bail. If you wanted to stop it there, you absolutely can. It's a lovely way of using your memory wire pliers to create something that isn't a memory wire design, basically. So what I'm going to do now is just show you how you can set a bead simplistically in the centre of this design. If that is your desire, you can absolutely join me for that now. So I've just hammered the extremities of the design. I feel like I'm always showing you hammering, so I haven't done that today. I've just been very careful to rest only the loop section onto the block and then press down cautiously there. I have very gently tapped over the top, which I know I've spent the last 11 years of my jewellery making tutorial career telling you not to do, but in this instance, if you've lined everything up, a very gentle little tippity tap won't go amiss. Now I'm going to use some more of that bronze colour wire, and I have a 12-inch length. It's 0.4mm or 26 gauge, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by laying the centre of my fine wire over the centre of the design, and I'm just going to draw that around, pop the tail back up inside the very centre and sneak that down into the middle. So once that's set into position, I'm going to grab my bead of choice, and because the gap that we were aiming for was approximately 4mm on the loops, I think I need to find myself a 3mm bead. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is take the tail of wire that's just here, and I'm going to sneak that down through that same gap again, bring it down underneath the design, and then I'm going to wrap around the outmost of those large loops. So you can wrap all the way around if you wanted to add a little bit of a wire weaving decoration. I'm just going to go for 3 turns of wire, and then I will continue all the way around in a little while. The next thing I'm going to need to do is to find the correct bead, so I'll be back with you in just a sec. So I found myself a 3mm faceted bead, which I'm going to attempt to put on the end of the wire that's sitting over the middle of the design at this time. So my eyes and my fingers, just be patient with me. There we go. So I'm going to allow the bead to set itself into the centre of the design, and then I'm going to take the tail of wire that is connected to the bead, post that down inside the loop that's on the opposite side from where we started. Let's just have a look. I think that looks really nice actually. So in order to replicate what we did on the first side, I'm going to now bring the tail of wire up inside the very central aperture where the bead is sitting. Bring that all the way around, and then what we're going to do is to sneak the wire down into the centre again, like so, and then pull that wire up in the gap between the large loop and the small loop. So it's kind of replicating what we're doing on the other side. So what we will do here is I will wrap off 3 times. That is once, twice, and I'm just going to use my nails to make that nice and neat and tidy, and then I'll push the wire down and away one last time. So if you just wanted to add on enough to keep that nice and safe and secure, you could simply trim away on the inside of the large loop. Let me bring it back to the correct orientation. But we've got a bead now set in the centre. Now I did set a 4mm bead on this one with some slightly heavier wire. I don't like how it looks, so I'll probably change that before I put this out on the photos later. But you'll see with the 4mm bead, it sits proud of the design, whereas with the 3mm bead, you can kind of sit that a little bit more in the centre. So it's entirely up to you. What would look really lovely in there is a nice bicone. Now, if your wire wrapping doesn't sit equal and opposite, you can take a moment to just get that to sit exactly how you want it to. I quite like how that little 3mm bead is sitting in the design. So I will finish this off and take a photograph for the outro screen. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you've had a lovely time so far, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.